I did not begin with giants. I began with a doorway, a broken threshold in an American ruin, still carrying a height that the bodies passing beneath it no longer seemed to justify. Not ornamental in the usual sense, not merely theatrical, just excessive in a way that feels practical before symbolic. That distinction matters more than it first appears. Builders can waste money on facades. They do not waste it casually on thresholds. Height must be framed, secured, maintained, heated around. When unusual scale repeats across ruined structures, the question changes. The doorway stops looking like style. It starts looking like an old requirement no one remembers. The doorway is what stays with you first, not the ruin in its entirety, not the familiar romance of weathered stone, the softened language that turns structural remains into scenery. The opening itself is what persists, its vertical insistence, the way the surviving masonry appears committed to a scale the modern body does not quite satisfy. You stand before it and register something before you explain it. Not knowledge exactly, pressure, because the difficulty is not beauty. Beauty explains ornament. Beauty explains spectacle. This feels narrower, harder, more specific. It feels like a measurement still carrying the logic of the world that produced it. A facade can exaggerate. A carved surface can flatter. A monument can be built to impress the eye and justify its cost through sheer display. But a threshold belongs to another category. A threshold is where passage is managed. It is cut where bodies, burdens, tools, carts, and weather must be negotiated. It is framed where weight has to be redistributed. It is secured, repaired, heated around, defended, maintained. Height there is not abstract. Width there is not abstract. Clearance there is not abstract. When a doorway rises beyond what ordinary movement appears to require, the question changes quietly but completely. We are no longer asking what looked grand. We are asking what had to pass through. The official explanation is familiar because it arrives in nearly every case. Monumentality. Prestige, sacred drama, civic theater translated into stone, the urge of earlier societies to make power visible by enlarging everything around it. Some of that is true. I do not think it is useful to deny what clearly belongs to ceremony. There are entrances designed to humble the visitor, to elevate the institution behind them, to announce that one is passing into a world above ordinary life. But the word explanation begins doing too much work once it is asked to account for every surviving excess of scale. Grandeur may explain some thresholds. It does not explain all thresholds equally well. That distinction matters. Because what begins to trouble the eye is not one celebrated archway, but repetition. The same upward allowance appears in more than one setting, more than one shell, more than one type of ruin. Not only in churches or halls built to stage hierarchy, but in structures whose surviving remains feel more practical, more institutional, more workmanlike. The decorative layer, where it existed, is often damaged or gone. What survives is the dimension itself, and the dimension continues to make a claim that the later description of the building does not fully absorb. If this were mere vanity, it was vanity with unusual discipline. If it were symbolism alone, it repeated itself with a consistency that feels expensive in a way symbols rarely are, unless they also protect a use. That is the part official summaries tend to flatten. Old construction was not loose sentiment hardened into brick. Every extra foot of opening meant extra material, extra engineering, extra exposure, extra labor, extra difficulty in securing the aperture against weather, cold, theft, heat loss, and decay. A tall doorway is not simply a larger version of a normal one. It alters the wall around it. It alters the loads above it. It alters the scale of whatever the building expects to admit. People who build at scale still discriminate. They do not enlarge everything equally. They enlarge what must be enlarged according to the demands placed upon it. A gate may be ceremonial. A court entrance may be theatrical. But once unusually tall thresholds begin appearing in settings with workmanlike bones, the burden shifts. The structure is no longer obliged to prove its extravagance. The explanation is obliged to prove why extravagance became practical often enough to be repeated. Standards have a way of surviving long after the language needed to explain them disappears. A later population may inherit dimensions without inheriting reasons. It may occupy rooms built for uses it no longer practices. It may rename structures whose proportions came from a different operational world. Function is easier to lose than form because form remains visible. The wall remains. The opening remains. The measurements continue applying pressure long after the brief that produced them has vanished. What remains, then, is not simply a ruin. It is a shell still carrying instructions no one can fully read. That possibility becomes harder to dismiss when the building shows signs of adaptation rather than origin. Raised floors, narrowed passages, openings partially filled, new levels inserted into volumes that seem originally to have been left uninterrupted. These changes do not explain the old scale. They reveal later pressure against it. A smaller world appears to have moved into a larger envelope and tried, patiently, to domesticate it. The old height survives anyway, not as decoration, but as residue. And once the doorway is understood this way, the question changes again. Instead of asking why earlier builders irrationally wasted resources on giant entries, we begin asking what kind of movement, burden, ceremony, body or environmental requirement once made such clearances ordinary enough to repeat. Because repetition is the clue. A fantasy may appear once. A fashion may flare briefly. But when a costly proportion returns across ruins, the official explanation has already become thinner than the stone itself. The doorway stops behaving like style. It starts behaving like a surviving requirement from a world whose scale was either larger, heavier, taller, or otherwise more demanding than the one that came after it. Once the doorway is read as a surviving measurement rather than an ornamental flourish, it stops standing alone. The eye begins to notice the company it keeps, ceiling heights that remain strangely generous even after collapse. Windows placed too high for the last occupants who seem to have used the shell. Corridors whose vertical allowance exceeds ordinary pedestrian need. Staircases whose rhythm feels slightly out of agreement with the body now climbing them. Halls whose internal volume appears excessive until one allows the possibility that the doorway, the wall, the stair, and the space above were all solving the same problem together. Then the anomaly changes scale. It is no longer one oversized entrance. It is a whole dimensional grammar that matters because buildings are not assembled accidentally. Proportions speak to one another. A threshold belongs to the room it admits. The room belongs to the ceiling containing it, the circulation paths feeding it, the apertures ventilating it, the loads pressing above it, the uses repeated there often enough to justify the expense. When several elements lean in the same direction, unusual clearance, unusual height, unusual internal volume, explanation can no longer remain in the realm of taste. Taste shapes surfaces. Systems reveal requirements. Requirements are always harder to dismiss than style. This is where the word giants has to be handled carefully. It attracts attention too quickly and can make the discussion less precise than the evidence deserves. Literal large bodies are one possibility because scale is the first thing the eye registers. But large bodies are not the only cause of large thresholds. Large burdens require clearance. Large wheeled movement requires clearance. Large carried apparatus requires clearance. Dense smoke requires volume. Certain acoustic uses require volume. Crowd movement under conditions no longer familiar to us may require volume. The important point is not to decide too early. It is to notice that something repeatedly required more height than official summaries seem willing to explain. Even that does not reduce the strangeness. Because whether the missing factor was bodily scale, logistical scale, environmental scale, or some combination of all three, the ruin still preserves evidence of a world organized around different tolerances. That is the deeper pressure these places exert. Not merely that a doorway is tall, but that tallness appears normalized inside the structure, as though the added cost repaid itself through ordinary use. The opening does not feel like an exception, asking to be admired. It feels like an assumption. Many ruins become easier to read once inheritance is allowed back into the picture. A later public may have passed beneath the doorway without needing its full height, just as a later administration may have occupied halls it did not design. Rooms can be subdivided, floors can be inserted, arches can be reduced from below. Thresholds can be narrowed while leaving the older structural logic visible around the margins. The building survives, but in translation, and translation preserves surfaces more easily than specifications. Names change faster than measurements. The archive often tells us what a place became. The proportions still suggest what it was built to do. That is why retrofits matter so much. They are confessions in masonry, an infilled band beneath a towering arch, a later lintel cutting across an opening that once rose much higher, a floor inserted awkwardly into a chamber that appears originally to have been left uninterrupted. These changes reveal pressure from a smaller operational world trying to domesticate a larger inherited envelope. They do not explain the envelope itself. They only prove that later occupants found it excessive enough to modify, yet durable enough that they could not fully erase it. The old scale remains around the patchwork like a memory refusing correction. And once scale is read this way, the ruins begin to say something more unsettling than the easy slogan that they were built for giants. They suggest that America may preserve fragments of an older dimensional order whose users, purposes, and physical expectations no longer fit the people who inherited the shells. Some will prefer the literal image of vanished enormous beings. Others will prefer the language of lost functions, lost transport needs, lost ceremonial technologies, or lost environmental regimes. The doorway does not force us to choose prematurely. It only insists that the official story, as usually told, is too small for the measurements that remain. What official history often does in such cases is substitute category for explanation. Church, depot, hall, asylum, factory, courthouse. Once the label is attached, the pressure of the question weakens. But labels are not functions. They are often only the last names assigned by later administrations to structures they inherited in altered form. A reused shell may wear many names across a century and still preserve the proportions of its first purpose beneath them all. To say that a building became a station or an office is not to explain why its thresholds were cut at a scale later users merely tolerated. Description is not recovery. Classification is not understanding. So the final pressure point is not proof in the courtroom sense. The ruin does not rise and testify. It does something quieter and, for that reason, more difficult to dismiss. It keeps presenting a physical question no one has answered well. Why was this much height necessary, often enough to become normal? Why do the surviving thresholds of some American ruins still appear calibrated to a world larger, taller, heavier, or otherwise more demanding than the one described in ordinary historical summaries? And why does discussion retreat so quickly into style, prestige, symbolism, anything except operational need? I do not think the doorway gives us a complete answer. It gives us something more stubborn. It gives us a mismatch. Our bodies pass through. Our explanations do not. The stone continues holding a measurement that modern language treats as incidental because admitting its seriousness would reopen other questions as well, about corridors, ceilings, stairs, halls, movement, labor, and the forgotten standards tying them together. Once those questions return, the ruin stops behaving like picturesque debris. It becomes a remainder. Perhaps that is why the doorway lingers in the mind longer than any argument attached to it. A modern person standing beneath an old threshold feels, if only for a moment, like a later occupant in someone else's scale. Not in a fairy tale, not in a cartoon world of easy exaggeration, in the remains of a built environment whose original tolerances were set by conditions we no longer know how to name. The doorway survives. The reason for it does not. And in that gap between preserved proportion and missing explanation, the old world keeps one of its most unsettling secrets in plain sight.